Like I mentioned, that case with the Word and the Excel macro documents, we have all that information they grab, the internal IP address, the username, the host name, all that stuff we can get out over DNS.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Security Tools Podcast. Today, we are going to talk about some really interesting stuff that allows you to track documents and even URLs to unmask attackers who may have gotten access to a sensitive area or access to sensitive information. My guest today is Adrian Sanabria. Is that correct?
Sanabria.
Sorry. Adrian Sanabria, joining us from Thinkst Canary. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Yeah, excited to be here.
So I've talked to my friend Joel, who has made something that is into some of the same kinds of tokens that Canary makes. But there are some important differences because not only do you guys make a straight up URL-based one that is links that go through to maybe something that people are expecting to see, but you guys also make some additional ones like DNS tokens and some other ones that are less traditional, but allow them to be used in some really interesting and cool ways. Can you explain a little bit about what your company does and specifically some of the projects that researchers can get their hands on that are free community tools?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the basic idea is just to detect when suspicious stuff is going on. And we've got two products. One is our canaries, and then we have our Canarytokins. And the canaries, their purpose is to detect suspicious stuff going on a network. So they sit there, they look like a legitimate system. They look like anything from an IBM mainframe to a Windows Server 2016, maybe a NAS device, maybe a printer. And just wait for somebody to come along, say, hey, that looks interesting. That looks like it's got something I want on it, maybe a file share, something like that, and they try to grab it. And we send you an alert when they start touching it, messing with it, stuff like that. And then the tokens, the idea there is not all attacks touch your network. If somebody steals your credentials, logs into your email account, we're not going to catch that with the Canary because they're not on your network. They're hitting Office 365 or Gmail or something like that. So you need some other way to detect attacks that just hit the cloud or your, Dropbox or something like that. And that's where the Canarytokens come in. And these can be anything from a file to a bit of code that you can embed somewhere. And when an attacker, same thing, we're kind of social engineering the attacker, kind of switching the roles here, where we're tempting them to take a look at something, to open something, to use some credentials. And the moment they do, they've fallen into a trap. And in most cases, they don't even know that they've fallen into a trap. But something they've done that you've tempted them to do has sent an alert, and you get that alert. So yeah, like a burglar alarm for your network and for your systems.
What I really like about this is it kind of gives people, even on a very small scale, because this project is, I don't know, is part of this open source or is it just free for researchers to use?
Yeah, so for the Canary side, we have Open Canary. It's on GitHub. It's well documented. You can find it. Lots of people use it. And much simpler version of the commercial canaries that we build and sell. But yeah, so that's an open source project. And then parts of the tokens are open source, and we also just run a public server that's completely free. You don't even have to create an account. You can just go to canarytokens.org and create tokens to your heart's content. And last I checked, there's something like 100,000 plus people that use that service.
So I really like that this gives people who might have something that maybe someone with a technological advantage, maybe someone who has access to the network, or in some cases, when we talk about domestic abusers, someone who might have a shared account. This gives some people the ability to fight back against that and maybe be able to detect when their data is being accessed in a way it shouldn't be, and at least be able to, for one, know that they've been breached, and for two, maybe get an idea of who is breaching them based on the information that's gathered from the attacker that clicks on whatever that link is. And you brought up some really interesting examples of how people who are worried about their email being broken into or some other more personal stuff that isn't just about business can use this because it is, again, a free service that anyone can access.
Yeah, and the nice thing about it is you don't have to be overly technical to get good use out of these tokens. You do have to kind of come up with the use case here. You have to think about your attacker, maybe what motivates them, what would they be interested in? What should I name this file? So I can create a Word document, regardless of how technical you are. You could hit canarytokens.org, create it, put a name on the file that you think the attacker would be interested in, put it in a place that you think they might find it. Maybe you think somebody's got access to your computer, but you don't know for sure. Or you think somebody might have access to your email. Like if you're using Gmail or something like that, there may not be a good way to tell if somebody else is using your credentials there. More and more, we're actually seeing some of these public services, these SaaS services will tell you, hey, was this you that logged in from this new IP address and things like that. But there's still a lot that don't. And by scattering these files about, you have another way of finding that out.
Well, I'm also thinking of some cases now where people are being forced to stay at home. And for a lot of, I know in particular, a young lady who is very kind of, let's just say that her dad is very, very controlling and looks over her shoulder, logs into her accounts, looks through her things, and then berates her for all sorts of stuff that she's, not really doing wrong. People who are in situations like that really don't have control because they live in a shared space where they might not, be able to contribute enough financially to assert their rights to have real privacy. So sometimes knowing whether or not someone's gone through your stuff can be really difficult if someone actually has access to the physical device that you yourself are logging into. So if you're in a shared resource at home, or if someone's caching your passwords, if you're like a student and you have someone who's logging into your stuff and you don't know about it, something like that is also a case where someone who's in a domestic abuse sort of scenario where they might not have access to a secure device, where someone might be able to look over their shoulders, at least they would be able to know about that. And if they're planning on, trying to go to the police or something like that, at least they would be able to show some evidence that that were happening, which I can say is pretty difficult to do if you're not a technical person and you're not sure if someone's actually accessing your stuff or not. And this is pretty cut and dry. Like, if you're seeing an IP address that isn't yours logging in, then, unless you've recently, logged in from another access point, or, if you're using a different VPN, it's a pretty definitive evidence that somebody is getting access to something that they shouldn't be getting access to.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the domestic cases, it gets a little bit more difficult because you're going to be connected to the same Wi-Fi and the same network. You're using a lot of the same resources. There's still things that you can do, but yeah, there's, I think, some different solutions for those kinds of situations. Maybe I've seen apps where when you unlock the phone, it takes a photo of who's doing it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's just interesting that normal people can use this sort of thing to monitor, maybe an ex who happens to remember your password, logging into your account and going through your things, or just those sorts of things that, everyday people don't really have a defense against. As you mentioned, you can look through the logins and see if there's any suspicious IP addresses. But if you're logging in from a bunch of different things in your local city, and maybe that person lives in the same area, that might not necessarily trigger, a login event, like provided that it's from the same general geographic area. And maybe it's a place you've been to before, a coffee shop or something like that. There's all sorts of scenarios where you just would really like to know if someone was in there going through your most sensitive stuff. So it kind of makes sense that if there's a free tool out there that can just alert you every time that happens, it's definitely one of those things where it's better to know if it's free and you're not really losing anything by having a email that happens to trigger you every time someone opens it, and it's just titled something really spicy that an attacker or someone with a personal agenda would go to first.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of good stuff, and there's a book called The Smart Girl's Guide to Privacy, and I made both my kids read it when they turned 13. They started having access to social media accounts and stuff like that, and it's a good general book just for you to have awareness of what's possible on the internet, like how people can abuse you, how they can get information about you, through the different accounts and services you use, and how you can protect your own privacy. And I think it would be neat to. I've not really seen any good guides out there. Maybe there's something I've overlooked, but it's an idea that I've been throwing around. Is at least contributing to some kind of guide that's like an OPSEC guide for the average person. How to protect yourself. How especially in certain scenarios, what tools are at your disposal, especially free tools that are easy to access, that we just want people to be aware of and know that option's there.
Yeah, I really want to talk to, actually, at some point, Eva, the cybersecurity director from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, because she deals with a lot of cases of cyber stalking and kind of this exact scenario. Because I'm sure she's probably heard of this as like one of the ways to monitor that sort of thing, and I'm sure she would have a lot of interesting things to say. I've reached out to her, so maybe I could continue this conversation with her, because I think she might have some really good resources for people who are in that sort of situation that need some tools to make sure that their accounts are locked down and they're doing everything they can to make it difficult for people to get into their accounts.
Yeah, I bet she would. Yeah, I've read a lot of the stuff that she's written.
So there were some other scenarios you mentioned that to a person that doesn't understand how the sort of web tracking works sound almost impossible, but are actually real ways that a canary token could catch someone. And I wanted to go over tokenizing documents because we mentioned somebody accessing a file on a server, but actually being able to track that person after they take the document out of that environment and it's back in the wild and you don't know exactly who's going to be touching it after that, that's something that I think would be really interesting to people who aren't aware of how it works.
Yeah. So a lot of our tokens just use different tricks that we found to where when you open a PDF or when you open a Word document or you browse to a Windows directory, the way that this software works, and it's not really a bug, this is just the normal way that these products work. These are features within the products that we're leveraging here. We can have it reach out to a web server and touch a web server on a very specific URL that we embed in that document. And that's how you can have a Word doc that I could email to somebody. Maybe they steal my flash drive, maybe they steal my credentials, download it from my Google Drive. Any place in the world that where they're connected to the internet, that's going to reach back out to that Canary token server and let you know that somebody's opened that document. So it's really nice because there's no extra software involved. We're just using the file formats and what they support, within those little portable bits of data, and it just works. And you can change the content of the file. You can change the name of the file. It doesn't break the trap that's embedded within.
So this file then becomes kind of like a tagged animal, where once it goes out into the wild, everyone who comes into contact with it, suddenly you're getting information about who is accessing that, and basically the information that's left your server or left your Gmail account. So if one particular person is the only person who has access to that, you would know because it would only be a single IP address that was opening it. But if suddenly a chain of people were to access it, it would be much easier to track where that document had gone and who was accessing it, or if more than one person had access to it.
Right. And the real power of the token here, occasionally we see somebody do this, but they might generate a token, put it on 500 laptops, and then they get an alert, and the realization hits them, oh, I probably should have put 500 tokens on 500 laptops because now I
One
don't know
of
which
these
one.
laptops.
Yeah, one of these 500 is in trouble, and I can't check them all individually. But yeah, that's kind of the key philosophies behind it is you have this trap that only exists in one location. And so when you get an alert from it, and it depends on the Canary token, some of them give you a lot of detail, some of them it's not a whole lot of detail. But what makes it really valuable is somebody had access to that one unique flash drive or had access to your inbox because that token didn't exist anywhere else except for that one place.
So this also extends to physical locations because you mentioned an example that I thought was incredibly ingenious where you could have a restricted area that has a QR code that basically looks like it's containing sensitive information that maybe even links to sensitive information, which hopefully isn't too sensitive, maybe just bait. But in going to that link, you would be revealing that you had basically access to a restricted area. So you would be kind of exposing that you'd gotten unauthorized access to that area and then either tried to go to that link or otherwise done something with the information when you shouldn't have. So if you don't scan the link, there's still the possibility where if you have the URL or if you get the URL, if you don't click on the link, there's still the possibility that even sharing it with another person without clicking it could still get you caught. So that really blew my mind when I started thinking about it, that, someone taking a photo, scanning it with their phone, and then being like, hey, what's this URL? And passing that to another person in a chat could still tip off the person who wants to know who's been in that area. And then that person who was shared on it is, now involved in triggering an alert on that particular token. Can you explain to me how that works? Because that just seems wild that, a photo someone takes on their cell phone could be shared with someone else. And then without even clicking on it, it could be known that someone was sharing that data.
Sure, yeah. So, like in our case, what we use for that is we just use a QR code, and a QR code is just it's a visual representation that can be, with software converted back into data. and there's a limit to the amount of data, but you can easily fit a URL in there. And that's what we do. It's the same URL that we might use in a fake email where we trick the attacker into clicking that link, much in the same way that attackers try to trick us with phishing emails into clicking links. We're doing the same thing back to them, except in this case, it's just embedded in that QR code. So most phone cameras, or if you're using like a special QR code scanner app or something like that, will prompt you, say, hey, do you want to open this link? And getting somebody to do that, that's again where the social engineering comes in. Wherever you use that QR code, maybe you've got some text around that says, free candy if you scan, or free credentials, or, here's the password to the server, whatever you think might get an attacker to follow that link. And once they do, it works just like our normal web links, where that attacker's web browser on their phone is going to reach out to the Canarytokin server, and we get some data from it when it does, because web browsers, that's just how they work. If you want a website to look right on a phone, you want that phone to say, hey, I'm a phone. And in a lot of cases, that like on my Android phone, it'll specifically tell you, hey, I'm a Samsung Galaxy Note 8, like very specifically, and I'm running this version of Android, and I'm using the Chrome web browser. And then the website knows, okay, this is the version of the website I'm going to give you. And we're just using that to identify these devices, and that can be useful information, because if you take that QR code, you put it somewhere, all of a sudden you get an alert that, somebody with a Samsung Note 8, is in a secure area that they probably shouldn't be in, because people that are authorized to be in that area know not to scan the QR code because it's a trap. You go and you inspect that area, you see somebody handing a Samsung Galaxy Note 8, and they're going to look pretty guilty.
That's pretty funny. So you can even trace the individual device just by analyzing what happens. Now, you also sent me a QR code, which I've now accessed. And I'm curious, I've attempted to spoof my user agent to make it look like I'm running a Nokia device. I'm curious if you're able to figure out what exactly I'm running.
Yeah, so yeah, I while we were chatting, I slipped that QR code to you, hoping you would do something with it. And yeah, you look like first of all, you look like you're coming from Kirkland, Washington, which I think is Eastern Washington, if my geography is correct.
That is around the geographic area. Yes, yes. So I chose not to disrupt our chat, but to throw up a VPN to throw off your trail. But yes, I'll say that's the general regional area.
Yeah, and so your user agent says Nokia 5250 Symbian OS 9.4.
That's me. Only
yeah.
It's not though. I'm on a MacBook Pro. But
right,
as you can see, I guess there's a little bit of wiggle room if you're running, browser extensions.
But it does say Safari.
Yep.
It does say Apple WebKit, and it does say Safari, which does not fit a Nokia at all, I wouldn't think.
Exactly.
But a lot of that stuff user agents are terrible, because you have to abuse them to get the web page to look right. So there's a lot of stuff that gets thrown in those user agents that's not accurate to that device. And it's just done for, because the web is just a complete mess. And standards don't mean anything, so nobody follows them.
That's pretty amazing. So even though I was running a user agent to try to hide, you were able to see that, my initial user agent probably wasn't truthful, just based on all the other software that was running. So that's pretty cool. And it again, for a normal person who just wants to be able to distinguish whether someone's using a very cursory level of deception, it's, I think, a pretty good way of being able to do that. Now, I'm also going to try to scan it on my phone. And you and I discussed that sometimes not even clicking on this, you can actually have a detection happen. So I'm curious to see if I might be able to trigger a detection just holding up on an Android phone. So now it's popped up a little link for me to follow, but I'm curious if there was any other detection.
Nope, nothing else came in.
Okay, so we can confirm that just scanning this on an Android device isn't enough to trigger it. But then now you should have a good detection.
Yep.
And is it leaking my location on that one as well?
Not your real one. Not unless you somehow teleported over to Eastern Europe.
No, my real location. Okay, so I guess it didn't work. Well, now you know where I really am. That's too bad.
Travnik.
Okay, well, that's fun. So, but I'm sure that if you were to look at that, you would be able to see all sorts of other things, like maybe that my keyboard is in English or my time zone is in a certain area that would lead you to the conclusion that that probably wasn't entirely truthful.
Right. Pixel 4 XL?
Yep. I already cracked it. first week?
So this information, just the real point here is that I know that you somehow got access to my top secret flash drive, which is what I've named this QR code. And presumably I've somehow attached it to that flash drive. I've taped it onto it or something like that, or there's a keychain with this QR code on it. So the fact that we can get this data about your device, about what scanned it, is kind of secondary. It's like a bonus. It's not the main thing we're after. The main thing we're after is, if this was only in my email inbox, I know I need to change my password right now because somebody else is somehow logged in, or I need to look at what other apps I've given access to my inbox, and I need to revoke some of those permissions.
That makes sense, because for businesses that, obviously I work for a company, Varonis, that provides the ability to do this for like every single file, make every file that's sensitive a honeypot. But a lot of smaller organizations, like you mentioned, like lawyers and other people that don't have the kind of IT support to implement this sort of thing, and they don't have the kind of budget to actually be able to really dive into these tools and use them across a large organization, they still have lots of files and they still deal with tons of sensitive stuff, even if they can't afford to protect it in the way that you can with, plenty of money and a good budget. So it's really key that I think these sorts of smaller businesses and people who might have a lot of sensitive stuff but not have any way to monitor access to it because maybe it's shared, or maybe there's an easy way for it to be exfiltrated, like at least give some way to get a canary in the coal mine when someone's beginning to exfiltrate data or log into stuff that they shouldn't be, or start to touch stuff that everyone knows is a trap, so it means that someone from the outside is accessing it.
Yeah, something you mentioned earlier is kind of interesting about learning how data travels. So one thing inevitably that will happen if you play with Canarytokins a lot is eventually you'll have AV, or maybe even upload it to a virus scanner just to see what happens. And if you want to make a list of all the IP addresses, all the systems that an AV company or maybe Microsoft uses to investigate malware and to test it out and stuff like that, they've got these sandboxes where they throw them into actual Windows systems and stuff like that to see what happens when they run it. The nice thing about having a canary token is you'll get a list of those. They'll all come back to you every single time this is automatically opened in this malware analysis sandbox. You'll get a ping back. It's not something like you don't want to do it on purpose unless you want a whole bunch of alerts back. But it's interesting because you see this pattern, like you start to understand. Okay, here's how the analysis process works behind the scenes. First it goes to these first couple of servers. Now it looks like some actual researchers downloaded it and is now playing with that file. You kind of see these patterns come back, and you can watch the data travel from the alerts that come in every single time that file is open. And same thing like you mentioned with the QR code. Like if somebody took a photo of it but didn't follow the link and then sent that photo to someone else, there's entirely the possibility that that person is using some software that says, hey, there's a link here. Do you want to follow it? And they do follow it. So back when I used a pen test, I remember I had one situation where we were doing phishing, as part of a pen testing engagement. And we just had this super simple like fish that I don't think anybody would fall for now, but it was like passwordhealth.com, and like put in your password, we'll tell you how strong your password is. Like I hope nobody fall for that these days. But back then, so even back then they didn't. So the person that got the email, one of the people that we sent it to, forwarded it to everyone in the whole company. And this was a defense contractor that basically had like people for hire in, wartime engagement, those kinds of areas, so one of those kinds of companies. And eventually, after being forwarded like 9 times, and the reason I know this is I got in the person's inbox because they actually went to the website and put in the password, their own real password twice. After that email was forwarded 9 times with the original link still in there, still clickable, a native Iraqi that, didn't have great command of English got that, didn't understand, don't click this, and password health, this must be a compliance thing. Like I got to test out my password. So they did. And, yeah, and they didn't sanitize it before forwarding it, but it was just a comedy of errors where, like for it to be forwarded that many times and then somebody actually finally falls for it was just fascinating to me.
Wow. So someone finally interpreted it as an order and actually did it.
Yeah.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and it was a cultural issue. It was like, okay, yeah, this is something I have to do, this is corporate compliance.
That's amazing. And also a little scary just because, you generally don't have that kind of visibility on something that's that dangerous. You might get an after action report, but being able to actually show like this is where it traveled and these are the people, that'll forward anything. Like that presents a real danger to those organizations that they probably wouldn't have visibility for, especially if they're smaller and they're not, a giant defense contractor.
And that's the power of a trap that, where the trap travels easily like that. So in these canary tokens can be links, they can be files, all sorts of different formats that are portable and travel.
So I've also really been interested in some of the use cases where you'll start up a company computer and it will check in with its IP address. And I've used, for example, the referred by, I think it is, URL parameter to pass information about a computer. So you can do things like have a script that is I use to inject with USB rubber ducky that calls back to a tracking server and just reports information about its environment, like which wireless networks are nearby, or other things that could bust a VPN. So even if they're using a VPN and reporting false information, maybe even falsifying things like their user agent, you would still be able to, determine what their physical location was. The possibilities are really crazy. But can you tell me about some of the other applications that you found for just, having canary tokens on a physical system or checking in on a system that maybe has parts that should be accessed or parts that have been decommissioned?
Yeah. So we've actually got a token type that's a Excel document and Word document with macros. And so a macro is nothing more than a script. So we can do whatever we want with that script. So just like your situation where you're using the refer to field, or you can use the user agent to smuggle whatever data you want out, that macro, if somebody not only opens the file but enables the macro, which again you're using social engineering techniques to convince them that that's a good idea, we can then pull information off that local system and smuggle it out. But yeah, we get all kinds of interesting stories back from people that have used Canary tokens. Like I mentioned, over 100,000 people use that public service, and sometimes we get the wink and a nod, like hey, this technology is really cool. I had a long weekend, but just wanted to let you know it worked. And sometimes we actually get some details. And one case where we got some details, and I think this was even shared in the public domain, somebody said that they had just a Word document macro on the root of I think it was a Windows server, so C:// I don't know what they named the file, but they had a token there. And the server lived out its life. They decommissioned it, deleted all the data, server's gone. I think they had completely forgotten that they put that token on there. And we hear this all the time. It's like, I completely forgot I created that token 3 years ago, and I just got an alert from it. So a month after they decommission the server, delete all the data, delete all the backups, they get something like 6 pings from Russia from
Which is the
data that was
worst.
on the server. But the server is no more. So yeah, how'd that happen?
Wow. Well, it's just the thought that, for one, if I'm some guy stealing a server, that once I get that data, some of it could actually be active or actually be used to catch me. That's pretty incredible. But then thinking that also your decommissioned server is showing up in another country and the data that was supposed to be erased is suddenly being accessed, that is pretty terrifying and probably would be impossible to identify if you hadn't set something up that was that persistent to survive with the data that the person's trying to access.
They would have never known otherwise. Yeah. And what really got me about that is I'm really organized with stuff. So as part of decommissioning server, if it were me, I probably would have killed that canary token. I probably would have said, I don't need this anymore. Unless like them, I had completely forgotten that I had put it there in the first place. But after hearing the story, I was like, oh man, like I would have failed that because I probably would have cleaned up and gotten rid of that canary token, and I would have never known if I deleted, or decommissioned that canary token along with the server.
Every business that's ever had to get rid of information is wishing that they'd watermarked it essentially with a canary token that would call back to them if someone had recovered the data or was able to reconstruct something that was supposed to have been, destroyed.
Yeah, think of the music industry where you're always hearing about albums being leaked, or Hollywood movies, scripts are getting leaked. There's absolutely no reason you couldn't token all that stuff.
That's pretty incredible that we're at the point that a single file is all it takes to be able to reveal someone who's gone back through information that's supposed to have been destroyed or information that they shouldn't have been disseminating and are probably making a profit off of maybe.
Even if that doesn't tell you who did it or how, and the power of knowing, yeah, at least with PR or legal, you can get out in front of it, before it becomes a big issue. So like in the music case, you can get ahead of it and maybe get the official release out before they put it up on whatever website they're going to share it on.
Right. The first step in all of this is just knowing that the data has been accessed. As you mentioned, everything else is kind of secondary, and it's great to be able to attribute someone or to be able to understand the scope. But fundamentally, just knowing that it's been accessed is the best case scenario for having data being breached, because most people, if they don't have this sort of stuff in place, they find out years later when their customers' information ends up on a darknet website and someone starts reporting on it.
Yeah, and that's still a common narrative today. I think the Verizon DBIR from last year, good friends with the authors of that and a lot of the researchers that comb through that data and put together that wonderful report every year. And one of the things that came out of that is I think POS related breaches were just a hair's breadth away from 100% that were notified by a third party. So basically, fraudulent activity is the only reason we know that there was a breach there. And it's just, that narrative has just persisted for decades now. And they really need some way of knowing when that data is walking off.
Well, yeah, especially for small business owners or individuals who don't have an IT department to monitor those sorts of things. Usually the only tools are, maybe Gmail alerting you when there's a suspicious login or someone who is in an IP address that you've never logged in from before. Can you explain how someone might embed a canary token in something like an email or some other common service they use to be able to detect this? Like, what's the actual process of using one or setting one up?
Sure. So the commercial version, we actually have a method of just inserting it, if you use Office 365, into 100 or 1,000 mailboxes all at once. And what we've done is we've just pre-written the email, we've made it look attractive to an attacker, and we've already inserted some tokens in there. But you could totally just build your own as well. And the trick is putting it somewhere where it's not going to get looked at accidentally, but an attacker would find it. So attackers don't browse through things; they search through things. So if a folder's hidden, if an email is tucked away somewhere, that's actually the most likely place an attacker is going to look, and the least likely place that your normal employee or just a normal person is going to look. So there's a bunch of things you can do. I mentioned the web links. Most email is HTML based, very easy to just paste a link in somewhere or attach it to a few words in the email. You could also embed an image in that email. What you do is you upload an image to your Canary token server or to canarytokens.org. And every time that image is loaded from our server or from your Canary token server, we send you an alert. So you could embed that in an HTML email, and every time somebody views that email and enables images so that the images load, you get an alert. You could also have attachments on there. So the Word docs, the PDFs, the macro enabled stuff we talked about, any of that stuff can be attached to an email. And there's no reason you couldn't do all of the above. You could have a QR code in there. You could have a link. You could have an image load. And that's really where the value of these tokens come in, is once you start doing that, and with the commercial version, we have an API and you can just automate all this stuff. So you're not manually putting all this stuff together. You just throw a million of them out there. And they don't all have to work. They don't all have to be 100% foolproof, guaranteed to catch the attacker. When you've got enough out there that at least 1% will, and 1% is enough for you to know what's going on, and do something about it.
Well, an example that I really loved, because it was something I never would have thought of also, was a pretty substantial amount of the population has been laid off or is looking for new work. And you mentioned that job seekers can use this sort of thing to basically put a token on their resume and be able to determine whether people are actually opening the email, how many times their resume is being read, like how many times maybe the recruiter has read that resume if they've opened it multiple times. Like, that seems like an amazing way for people who otherwise have no visibility into that process to actually see a little bit about what's really happening on the other side, and whether they need to work on certain parts of their resume, or if they're just not maybe getting all the way through the review process.
We don't market it like that, but it has come to our attention that some people use it that way, yes.
I just think it's amazing that people can kind of design their own interaction with this sort of tool where, for free, you can really keep track of where something's going in a way that used to only be the domain of tracking companies and, advertisers who would do this on the behalf of, companies with massive budgets. What I like about this is it kind of democratizes this efforts, and people who want to be clever about, managing their data now have access to some of the really the most powerful tools of advertising and tracking that have been developed over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of these ideas that we're seeing, like stuff that people are doing with these tokens, are not these, super uber hackers or anything like that. They're just typical people that said, hey, heard about this on a podcast, went to play with it, had this idea to use it to token my resume, and it works really well. It's really cool. So absolutely, it's kind of enables some really cool hacky use cases for everyday ordinary people. All you have to do is have imagination enough to say, hey, what if I token this document, that goes through this process? What would I learn, once I release that into the wild?
Interesting. And now I have an idea that sprung into my mind that I'm going to have to ask you about another time. Or maybe I'll ask you now. So I know, do you guys do DNS tokens?
We do. We have DNS tokens. In fact, a lot of the Word document token we've been talking about has actually a DNS and a web token embedded within it.
So one thing that I thought was really interesting was there is the ability to create a tracking device, sort of, that is like basically a GPS tracker that connects to any open Wi-Fi networks, like a McDonald's Wi-Fi or a Starbucks Wi-Fi, that has a pop-up screen that requires you, to basically log in. And what it takes advantage of is the fact that basically DNS tunneling is the punchline to this. But it takes advantage of the fact that a lot of these hotspots will forward on DNS requests, and they will not forward on the response, but they don't block the actual DNS request from going on. And you can piggyback some information onto that, or at least try to add on another pin on the pin board if you're just checking in on something. So I've been looking at working with a friend on creating kind of Wi-Fi tracker devices that use DNS tunneling in order to identify maybe where someone's going without access to a cellular network or something a traditional GPS tracker might have. Do you think that DNS tunneling might be possible to trigger a canary token through a network like that with just a little microcontroller that's joining and sending an automated DNS request?
Yes, that should work. I have tested canaries, because I travel, well, before lockdown and all that, did a lot of traveling. So I've been at several hotels with canaries with me. And so our canary devices do everything over DNS. So they get firmware updates, they send out alerts, they get configuration updates entirely over DNS. And we do that so that, in the corporate environment, you don't have to go through change control. You don't have to ask for a hole in the firewall to talk to our device. Yeah, you can just plug it into a network and it just works.
So is it using clever DNS steganography or just kind of packing inside the DNS in order to get it through otherwise a network that might restrict that sort of communication?
We're just using DNS text records. So, if you're a commercial customer, you get your own dedicated Canary token server and Canary console, and it's actually authoritative DNS. And that's how that DNS request gets back. That's why it doesn't have to talk directly to us for that to work. And it's just how DNS works. When you do a request, that gets back to the authoritative domain just through the system of DNS servers. So we're just using the way that DNS works for that to happen. And most of those networks that have captive portals where they forward you to a website, you've got to authenticate, DNS works just fine on them. That DNS will get back. What they're blocking you from doing is using your web browser and getting out, but they don't really care about DNS. In fact, I think for that whole captive portal piece to work, they need functional DNS. So I'm not sure that they even could block that.
That is amazing. And I'm going to talk to my friend Stefan, who specializes in working with ESP8266 and ESP32 microcontrollers to see if we can make an automated beacon that can go through those portals, because that I think would be really exciting and cool.
Yeah, and you can use Canarytokins.org. You could probably use that in your testing. And like I mentioned, that case with the Word and the Excel macro documents, we have all that information they grab, the internal IP address, the username, the host name, all that stuff we can get out over DNS. If there's no way to get it to a web server out from that network, it'll still get out over DNS. So absolutely, you can smuggle all that data out over DNS.
Man, okay, that's pretty exciting to know. And I'm a little disturbed by that, but I'm also happy that it works
It
because
sounds like a neat project, though.
yeah, right. Yeah, I've been meaning to try it for a while, so it's going to be interesting to see what information you can actually exfiltrate with DNS because it sounds like you can actually do quite a lot.
Yeah, I forget the actual data limit. It's in hundreds of bytes, and anything longer than that, you end up sending more than one DNS request. You just end up chunking it up and putting it back together later. And like on the commercial devices, everything's encrypted between the canaries and the cloud. So we actually, all that stuff going over DNS, because DNS is a clear text protocol for the most part still, though we're starting to see that change. It's just, it's in hex and it's, encrypted, and we decrypt it with the, on the other end, because we share public-private keys between the canary and the cloud. But yeah, with the tokens, it's also there's some data you can smuggle out that way.
Because I was going to say, if I was someone who wanted to build a tracker in that way, if I had something that would just connect to any open Wi-Fi network and then ping, a DNS server with maybe the MAC address of the network I was connected to, Google has a map of where all these networks are, because when they were doing their Google Street View, they were also collecting MAC addresses and all that information so they could do more accurate geolocation for phones. So and Wiggle Wi-Fi also.
Yeah, it's I haven't tried it on like public Wi-Fi, like coffee shop Wi-Fi, that kind of thing. But I do know it gets out just fine on hotel networks, which a lot of them use the same products and services. There's companies out there that just do captive portals.
Well, I know how I'm going to spend my weekend.
Yeah, let me know if you have any questions or anything. I'd love to help you test that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think we're coming up on towards the end. We've covered a lot, but is there anything else you would want people who, especially people that are just getting interested in security, to know about Canarytokens, as a tool, and maybe a way that they might get started using it in their everyday life?
They're really building blocks, and there's so many cool things that you can build off this. And we've seen, and that's really kind of what we're after with a lot of our products here is, here's some base building blocks, go build something cool. And that's like we talked about, like the web and the DNS tokens, we consider those kind of the token primitives that if you look at most of our other tokens, they're built from. And there's more places tokens can be built, so I'd urge people to really just think about the use case first. Like, sure, go check out the tokens, play with them so you understand what they are, what they can do, what scenarios you can use them in. So that's why we make it easy to grab them, to download them, to play with them. But then just think of the use case. Like, I would love to know when this leaves the organization, or when somebody picks this up or touches this. At that point, once you have those two things, you've got the need and some knowledge of what you can do with tokens and with that kind of concept. Then you start to find all the cool stuff that you can put together.
So I have a personal story for how I've used a Canary token. Back when I lived in Los Angeles, I really liked exploring storm drain tunnels because they're some of the most incredible graffiti you've ever seen. And I know it's a little weird. It's not sewers. They're different, just storm drain tunnels. But there's a really vibrant community of street artists who go down there and paint really incredible work. And I decided one day to, I love pranks. So I took a USB thumb drive and I put on it a PDF file, which was tokenized. I wanted to see who would actually, take a PDF file from a storm drain USB stick and actually run it on their computer. And I went into really deep in the storm drain where a lot of people paint. And I put a little LED with a battery underneath it, just lighting it up in the darkness, and then just painted a big arrow towards it and then just "For the Brave." And I stuck it there.
That's great.
And a week later, and so
that's some Banksy level stuff there.
Yeah, so a week later, it was gone. But on PDF, there was the information for a $25 Amazon gift card I had left over that I just wasn't using. I was like, this is the perfect opportunity. But whoever took it has not worked up the courage to open it yet, as far as I've been able to tell.
Really?
Yeah. But either that or they're a master hacker and they opened it on an air-gapped offline computer and just reaped the benefit of the gift card. Which, if you did it, you earned it. All I wanted to know was who you are. I just wanted to know I wasn't alone down there. So either there's a raccoon making a nest out of my secret USB, but I put it pretty high up there. So I'm pretty confident someone's just working up the courage to open the file. But so there's all sorts of interesting creative things you can do with Canary Token. I wish the finale of that story could have been that, I managed to find out who it was, but unfortunately someone took it, but they haven't opened it yet. But at least I know.
So for anyone else inspired to do something like that, the real trick with Canary tokens, don't treat them as expensive or fragile or anything. Do 10 flash drives and one with a PDF, one with a Word document, like throw a bunch out there. Yeah, and same thing like when we do phishing exercises, when we do drive drops, we would never just do one drop. Those flash drives are cheap. There's services you can get like 100 of them for $30 or something like that. You can even get them branded with whatever you want printed on them. But yeah, if you really want a response for something like that, don't depend on just one. Throw a whole bunch out there.
That's a good idea because I've been going to the RSA conference every year for the last 3 years and taking every single USB thumb drive from the press room because I care about their safety. Those poor people will just take it and plug it in like it's nothing. They didn't even read the email that says not to do that. I don't even know why they let them pass out USB thumb drives, but I make sure to scoop them all up. So I have, like 60 in my drawer now, ready to go if I ever needed to do something like that, which I almost definitely will.
Yeah, that's a handy use for those.
Yeah, as an art project, I thought it was a lot of fun. And it turns out that a lot of people were very provoked by the For the Brave sentiment. I tweeted about it, and that was, I think, one of the most interactions I got for any tweet I'd sent that entire year. So it turns out just like putting out what almost definitely looks like malware with just a challenging statement is enough to provoke most people into doing it. Who knew?
Were they angry about it? Like what was the response?
They wanted to know what was on the drive more than anything. I didn't have the heart to tell them that it was like, a $25 gift card and some tracking software. It just, the mystery really seemed to motivate people to want to take the risk. It's like, wow, I think I found like a way to get people to disinfect themselves just by just needing to know what this is.
Yeah, so I actually, our second year, I'm one of the organizers for B-Sides Knoxville. We've done actually electronic badges every year because one of our organizers is a hardware designer. That's actually all he does. And we just didn't have time to do it the second year. We were getting close to the conference. We still didn't have anything for badges. So I bought up a ton of floppy disks. And floppy disks have those two little holes at the top that you use for read write. And with the lobster claw style lanyard clips, it was perfect. Like it would just hang perfect. And so I found some really old printable floppy labels, and I found it was something like 350, 400 floppies, printed a bunch of labels, stuck them on them. And I had this idea to put some kind of data on there, to have some kind of like treasure hunt in the data on the floppy. They're all brand new floppies, so they should have all worked. And that was just one of the ideas that didn't make production. Had to fall by the wayside. They looked great. They presented great. And I felt so bad because everybody was convinced there had to be something on those floppies, and people were buying floppy, like they're scouring the internet for USB connected floppy drives, and like there are Twitter threads going where people are like, have you been able to read what's on the floppy? And I just didn't have the heart to tell everybody that, I didn't have time. I didn't get to that part. Like the conference was more important than getting something cool on that floppy,
Yeah, getting up the courage to go into the storm drain and do that was more important for me than getting a big payoff. But now I've got a lot of people telling me I should have been more aggressive with the detection and make it so as soon as they plug it in, it goes off.
Yeah, so you should have put a Windows folder token on there. So it's a desktop.
Wait, that's possible?
Yeah, it's a desktop.ini, and so it's not going to work if somebody plugs it into a Mac or a Linux system because they don't care about desktop.ini. But Windows uses the desktop.ini file to tell it, hey, view this in thumbnail view, or view this in detail view, or use this special icon or something like that. And we actually leverage one of those features to reach out to the Canarytoken server. You can actually tell it, hey, there's a resource in this desktop.ini that's on this remote server. And so when somebody views that on a Windows system, just plugs it in, opens up Windows Explorer, that's going to trigger an alert.
Wow. So it wasn't that I wasn't aggressive enough. I was using the wrong token.
Well, no, you weren't using the wrong token. You weren't using enough tokens.
I bet that's a common mistake.
Layers, man, layers.
So then I would have had like an 80% chance of detecting someone plugging it in because most people are Windows users, and that works against Windows computers.
So you token viewing the directory. You token the PDF. You have a link inside the PDF that's a token. You have a QR code inside the PDF that's a token. Like you can layer these things. You just, tokenception with it. Just go super deep.
That has given me a ton of ideas. And I think a good way of following up on them is maybe doing a live stream of creating a document or a couple documents that's tokenized and maybe showing off exactly what it looks like on the security, well, we're calling it Hacking with Friends, but it's on the Security Forward channel on YouTube. Would you be up for something like that?
We should totally do it.
Cool.
Crowd could, being a live stream, the crowd could participate. We could look for those bold individuals that will click links and scan QR codes.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Cool. Well, all right. I'm going to cut it off for today because otherwise we'll talk all day, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Thank you so much, Adrian, for joining. And I hope we can talk again about Canarytokins and also just all the great stuff you're doing.
Yeah. No, it's been a lot of fun. I'm glad you asked me to do this.
Of course. And if people wanted to keep up with all the great research going on at Canary and anything you're doing personally, how would they do that?
Yeah, sure. So canary.tools is the main domain. We've got a blog there as well. We've got blog.thinkst.com where we share a lot of the new cool research that we do, the ideas that we come up with, new features coming out in both the free versions of stuff and the commercial versions. And we have a GitHub as well, where I put together some of the scripts that we use to deploy these Canary tokens and to do cool stuff with them. So if you go to GitHub and look for Thinkst, like I mentioned before, Open Canary is there as well. So yeah, we've got all kinds of free resources that people can play with regardless of whether they're customers or not.
Awesome. Oh, I had one last question. Can you run the Open Canary on a Raspberry Pi? I don't know if I've read that somewhere.
You can install it anywhere that you can install Linux. If you can run Linux, you can run Open Canary.
Cool. Well, we might maybe do that as a null byte episode because that actually sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah. It's pretty cool.
Cool. All right. Well, awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us on another episode of the Security Tools podcast. If you like this one, make sure to check out our other episodes and our live streams on Tuesday and Friday. And if you want to see a replay of this, you can always go to the Security Forward YouTube channel where we have replays of this and our other content. Also, if you want to support us, go ahead and check out the Varonis Cyber Attack Workshop. And again, thank you to Varonis for sponsoring this podcast and making all of this possible. We'll see you guys next time.